The water remembers things that maps forget. That's what Clarence Duval's father used to say, standing on the dock in a gray hour before a Gulf Coast sunrise, watching the current move against itself in the places where the channel bent. He said the water kept its own records, that if you learn to read the surface, the color of it, the pull of it, the way it refused to lie still in certain spots, you'd know things that no chart could tell you. Clarence was 68 years old. He had been reading the water his whole life. He'd spent 31 years as a harbor pilot on the Perdido Pass, guiding cargo ships and tankers through the narrow throat of water that connected Mobile Bay to the Gulf. He knew that channel the way a surgeon knows an incision, not from study, but from repetition. He had moved through it in fog, in squalls, in the flat dead heat of August when the color of pewter, and even the pelicans stopped working. He had crossed it 6,000 times, maybe more. Now, he ran a bait shop at the end of the same dock, where his father had tied off in 1959. The building was corrugated steel on a wooden frame, a little crooked on one corner, where a tropical storm had pushed it in 2004, and he'd never quite gotten it straight again. Some things you stabilize and leave. The coolers hummed. He opened at 5 in the morning and closed whenever the last boat came in. He kept his father's piloting logs in a waterproof box under the counter. 12 volumes, going back to 1961, written in his father's small, precise hand. Position notations, current readings, depth soundings taken by eye and experience at the same markers year after year. The kind of data that doesn't appear in official surveys because nobody thought to ask the man who was there. Clarence had started keeping his own log a year. He earned his pilot's license. His father had handed him a blank notebook and said, "Write down what you see, not what you think. The difference matters more than you know." He still wrote in one every week. The first thing he noticed was the grass. Not an obvious change. Nothing that would stop you mid-step and make you look twice. In the summer of the year he turned 66, Clarence started seeing widgeon grass growing in places along the eastern edge of the channel where it hadn't grown before. Submerged grass, the kind that only takes root in shallow, calm water, the kind that tells you the bottom has risen. He marked it in his log, wrote the location, the date, the approximate extent of the new growth. Then he went back to his coolers. He didn't say anything to anyone. One summer of new grass growth could mean a dozen things: a shift in salinity, an unusually calm season, a change in water temperature. He had learned, over decades, that the water rarely communicated in single sentences. It communicated in paragraphs. You had to read the whole thing before you knew what it meant. The second thing he noticed came 6 months later, in late winter. He was running a charter out past the pass when he felt the boat pull differently in the cut, a drag on the port side that hadn't been there the previous fall. Subtle, the kind of thing a passenger would never feel, and a distracted captain might attribute to current variation. But Clarence had crossed this water 10,000 times, and he felt it the way you feel a familiar staircase in the dark, by memory and expectation, and a precise sense of when something is wrong. He made a note when he got back to the dock, compared it to his log entries from the previous year. The bottom of the channel was not where it had been. Not by much, but enough. That wasn't the part that worried him. The part that worried him came 3 weeks later, when he pulled out his father's 1963 log and read the entry from March 9th of that year. Unusual drag in the main cut today. Starboard pull gone. Port side heavy. Mentioned it to the harbor master. He said the survey was current. I said surveys don't feel. Clarence sat with that entry for a long time. Then he opened his own log and drew a slow line between his observation and his father's. 58 years. The same pull, the same side. The channel was moving. It wasn't something you could see from the surface, which was the problem. From a boat, the water looked the way it always looked. Gray-green in the morning, bright in the afternoon, opaque and indifferent to human questions. The buoys were where they'd always been. The navigation markers were in their assigned positions. A sonar survey, if you ran one on a calm day, would show a clean channel of appropriate depth. The instruments would tell you everything was fine. The instruments weren't wrong. They were just measuring the past. What Clarence understood from his father's logs from his own decades of attention was that the Perdido Pass channel migrated. Not quickly, not in ways that disrupted navigation or triggered official concern. 8 to 12 feet per year, drifting southeast along the bottom, a slow and patient wandering that had been happening since before anyone put a name to the inlet. His father had documented the drift rate across 3 decades. Clarence had continued documenting it across 3 more. The drift was consistent, quiet, and almost entirely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And now there was a dredging project coming. The Port Authority of Mobile County had partnered with a commercial dredging corporation, a large one, based in Houston, with a fleet of suction dredges and a track record of deepening harbors from Texas to the Carolinas, to widen and deepen Perdido Pass Channel. The project was designed to accommodate a new class of deeper draft cargo vessels. The economic case was solid. The federal permits were in order. The engineering plans had been reviewed and approved. The plans were based on a sonar survey conducted 18 months earlier. Clarence studied the project announcement in the county newspaper for a long time. Then he went under the counter and pulled out the waterproof box. He laid his father's logs on the counter beside his own. He ran his finger along the drift calculations he had made over the previous 3 years. He worked the math slowly, the way his father had taught him, not with instruments, but with accumulated observation. In 18 months, at the documented rate of drift, the main channel had moved between 12 and 18 feet southeast of where the survey showed it. The dredging corridor was aligned to the survey position. If the dredges worked where the survey said to work, they wouldn't be cutting into the main channel. They'd be cutting into the eastern shoulder, into the layer of sediment that had been building there for decades, the substrate that had accumulated in the channel's wake as it moved. He knew that eastern shoulder. His father had written about it in 1971, after a hard storm had cut through it and released a smell that fouled the air for 3 days. Decomposed marsh substrate, a buried layer of organic sediment laid down before the inlet shifted, compressed and sealed over by decades of silt, the kind of material that stays stable as long as it stays buried, the kind of material that, once disturbed, changes everything around it. He sat with that knowledge for 2 weeks before he made a phone call. The meeting with the Port Authority's project office was on a Thursday in October, in a conference room in a low building near the bay with a kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everything look slightly underwater. There were 4 people across the table: a project manager named Kessler, an engineer from the dredging company named Fontaine, a younger woman taking notes, and a man from the county planning office who seemed to be present mainly to observe. Clarence brought the waterproof box. He laid the logs on the table, his father's volumes first, then his own. He explained the drift rate. He showed them the calculations, the seasonal observations, the annotations his father had made across 30 years about the channel's behavior in storm seasons and calm ones. He showed them his own entries, the grass growth, the bottom drag, the slow accumulation of evidence that the channel was not what the survey said it was. Fontaine listened carefully. When Clarence finished, Fontaine thanked him. He explained that the dredging company had its own recent sonar data, a newer survey conducted 6 weeks before project approval. The data showed the channel within acceptable parameters. He said that channel migration was a known phenomenon, accounted for in the engineering model with a standard deviation buffer. Clarence asked what the deviation buffer was. Fontaine said 10 feet. Clarence said the channel had likely moved 15 feet since the survey. Fontaine said the model allowed for that possibility, and the dredging corridor was designed accordingly. Kessler said very politely that they appreciated the historical perspective, that the logs were remarkable, that it was a kind of documentation they rarely saw from community members. He meant it genuinely. That was clear. Clarence nodded. He put the logs back in the box. On his way out, he stopped in the parking lot and stood in the wind off the bay for a few minutes. He wasn't angry. He had delivered his piece. He had said it in plain language, with evidence, without drama. What happened next was not his to control. He drove back to the bait shop and opened his log and wrote one entry. October 14th, met with Port Authority. Drift calculation, not accepted. Dredging proceeds on survey corridor. Eastern shoulder sediment, not in their model. Wait and watch. He closed the notebook. He turned on the coolers. He opened up for the afternoon tide. The dredges arrived in December. Clarence watched them come in. 2 large suction vessels, their working arms raised against the winter sky. They anchored in the designated work zone and began their operation. The sound carried across the water at night, a deep mechanical vibration, lower than the shrimp boat engines, more constant. The first weeks produced nothing remarkable. The channel deepened as planned. The project tracker showed progress on schedule. The local newspaper ran a piece about the economic benefits of expanded cargo capacity. Clarence went to the dock every morning. He looked at the water. He wrote in his log. In the third week of January, one of the shrimpers who worked out in Marina, a man named Thibodeau who had been pulling nets in these waters for 30 years, came into the bait shop and sat down on a stool beside the register. He said the shrimp had gone strange. Not disappeared. Strange. The catch in the areas closest to the dredging corridor had dropped, which was expected. The disturbance would do that. But there was something else. The shrimp he was bringing up from the eastern edge of the work zone had a quality to them he couldn't exactly name. They weren't damaged. They weren't off-color. But they smelled different. A faint edge to them that he'd never noticed before. He asked Clarence if he knew anything about it. Clarence didn't say what he was thinking. He said he'd keep his eyes open. But he wrote it down. And then he thought about his father's 1971 entry. The one about the smell. Release a smell that fouled the air for 3 days. His father hadn't elaborated beyond that, but Clarence knew what organic marsh sediment released when it was disturbed. Hydrogen sulfide, the compound that smelled of rot and low tide and things buried too long. In high concentrations, it killed bottom life, drove shrimp out of their territory, changed the chemistry of the water in ways that didn't show up immediately on the surface but accumulated underneath. He pulled the 1971 log and read it twice. Then he thought, maybe it's not that. Maybe Thibodeau was picking up a seasonal variation. Maybe the shrimp were responding to the turbidity from the dredging, nothing more. The simplest explanation was usually right. He decided to wait. The waiting was hard. He had made his case. The case had been heard. Maybe the engineers were right. Maybe the deviation buffer had been sufficient. Maybe the channel migration was within their model's tolerance. He had been wrong before. He had misread the water before. The sea was not always trying to tell you something. Sometimes it was just water. By the end of February, there were dead patches. Thibodeau had a word for them. Poussières, he called them, an old Cajun term his grandfather had used for dead zones in the bay. Places where the bottom went still. Where nothing moved, nothing fed, nothing sheltered. The patches showed up in 3 locations along the eastern margin of the dredging corridor, first as diminished catch, and then as visible discoloration in the water, a faint sulfurous tinge, a change in how the surface caught the light. The Port Authority's environmental monitoring team sampled the water. They found elevated turbidity and dissolved organic material, within acceptable limits under the project's environmental permit. Their report attributed the dead patches to expected bottom disturbance and predicted recovery within 8 to 12 weeks of completion. Clarence read the report. He agreed with part of it. The turbidity was from the dredging. That was true. But turbidity didn't explain what Thibodeau had noticed about the shrimp smell. What Clarence was thinking about was different. What happened when you cut into organic substrate and the chemistry of it entered the water column? You could have turbidity from the dredge and sulfide chemistry from the buried sediment simultaneously, and a standard water quality test would capture the first and miss the second unless you were specifically looking for it. He wasn't sure yet. He held both explanations at once, the official one and his own, and looked for evidence that would separate them. It came in mid-March, from an unexpected direction. He was talking to a marine biologist from the University of South Alabama, who occasionally came to the dock to collect samples for a long-term tidal study. Her name was Dr. Vasquez, and she had been monitoring a shoal system on the bay's eastern margin for 11 years. She came in looking for bait and stayed for coffee, and somewhere in the conversation she mentioned that her monitoring stations on the shoal had started showing unusual readings. The shoal was migrating, not dramatically. Her survey poles, checked every 6 weeks for a decade, were showing consistent lateral movement on the northern face, the face that abutted the dredging work zone's eastern boundary. The shoal's anchor sediment was shifting. She wasn't sure why, but she was planning to take more measurements in April. Clarence asked her exactly where the shifting was occurring. She described the location. He went home that night and spread his father's 1961 log on the kitchen table beside his own notebooks. He found a passing observation from a December entry. Shoal anchor held through the blow. Solid from the channel side. Note for spring. Check if eastern shoulder substrate is still compacted after the cold season. His father had noticed a relationship between the eastern shoulder sediment and the shoal stability. He had written it down and moved on and never returned to it because nothing had disturbed the eastern shoulder in his lifetime. Now something had. Clarence sat for a long time. Then he called Dr. Vasquez. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, which was how these things usually went when the sea was the one making the argument. Dr. Vasquez took her April measurements and found the shoal had moved another 4 feet. She filed a formal report with the Coastal Resources Office. The Port Authority commissioned an independent geotechnical review. The review firm brought in sonar equipment and ran a full bottom survey of the work zone and its margins. They found what Clarence had described. The channel had migrated 15 feet southeast of the survey corridor. The dredging had cut into the eastern shoulder sediment. The disturbed substrate had released organic compounds into the water column, altering bottom chemistry in a zone extending nearly 400 feet from the cut. The shoal's instability was a direct consequence. Its anchor sediment was part of the same buried substrate that had been breached. The report was thorough. It was also careful to note that the dredging corridor had been designed in good faith based on available survey data, and that the channel migration rate, while documented in historical observation records, had not been captured in any officially filed dataset. The geotechnical firm's lead engineer asked, in a footnote to the report, whether the historical observation records had been made available prior to project commencement. The Port Authority's project file contained a record of the October meeting. It contained Clarence's name. The remediation took the better part of a year. The dredging corridor was adjusted, the cut sealed with engineered fill. The shoal stabilized eventually, though Dr. Vasquez's data showed it had moved permanently from its pre-project position. The dead patches recovered. By the following summer, Thibodeau was pulling normal catch from the eastern edge again. He came in one morning and said the water smelled right, like itself. Clarence said he was glad to hear it. There was a second meeting, a formal one, with representatives from the Port Authority, the dredging company, and the Coastal Resources Office. Clarence was invited. They asked him to walk them through what he had noticed and how his father's logs had shaped his understanding. He brought the waterproof box again. He talked for 40 minutes. He was not asked to simplify. He was not interrupted. The Coastal Resources Officer, a woman named Bridges, asked careful questions about the logs, how they were structured, how readings were taken, what conventions his father had used, and what he had changed. At the end of the meeting, Bridges said that the historical observation dataset represented the longest continuous record of channel behavior at Perdido Pass in existence. The Coastal Resources Office would like to digitize the logs and incorporate them into the official archive. Clarence looked at the box. He said yes. The lead engineer from the remediation firm came over after the meeting broke up. He said, without preamble, the thing that got us was a deviation buffer. We designed for 10 feet. We should have asked why 10 and not 20. We had the information to ask that question, and we didn't ask it. Clarence looked at him. He said, the information was in the box. The engineer nodded. He said he knew that now. The following spring, Clarence got a letter from the Port Authority's director. It was short, professionally written, and thanked him for his participation in the remediation review process. Attached to it was a map, a new navigational chart of the Perdido Pass Channel, updated with the corrected corridor position and annotated with the historical drift rate that had now been formally incorporated into the official dataset. In the lower left corner, in small text, was a notation. Channel migration data sourced in part from historical observation records, Duval family piloting logs, 1961, present. His father's name was there, and his own beside it. He put the letter under the counter, in the waterproof box, beside the logs. He closed the lid. He opened the shop. The water moved the way it always moved, patient and purposeful and indifferent to human projects, carrying its history in the pull of it, the color of it, the way it changed in the places where the bottom had something to say. The channel was where it had always been going. It had always known. It had simply been waiting for someone to write it down.